It's the week ending Friday the 13th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump claiming migrants are eating pets in his TV debate with Kamala Harris, over 1,700 inmates being released early from UK prisons, and the death of esteemed actor and the voice of Darth Vader, James Earl Jones, at the age of 93. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and Irenie Forshaw. And from my daily history podcast, Today in History with the Retrospectors, it's Mr. Arion McNicoll. Welcome, everybody. Have any of you ever eaten an animal that some would consider a pet?
Birds.
Yes, I suppose so. I keep
eaten a lot of birds, and there might be some people, I don't know any of them obviously, but there might be some people that assume pets could include birds.
Irenie, have you ever munched on a gerbil?
Never. No, I had hamsters growing up, so I would never do that.
I thought you hated your hamster.
No, my cat ate my hamster, but yeah, that's another story.
Oh, this is a tabloid headline in the waiting.
Yeah. Don't tell Trump. Harry, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, Pope Francis ate, prayed, and loved his way around Asia.
The sound there of the Pope being driven through massive crowds in East Timor on Monday. Arion, your story of the week, why?
Yeah, so this week Pope Francis completed a 12-day Asia-Pacific tour where he stopped off at 4 countries. He started in Indonesia before heading to Papua New Guinea, then on to one of the region's poorest countries, East Timor. We just heard from people shouting on the street as the Pope-mobile went past. Actually, an estimated 600,000 people came out in East Timor, nearly half of the country's population, which is incredible. And then he finally finished his journey in Singapore. And this marathon 4-nation tour was pretty non-stop, but Francis, who is now 87 years old, seemed to be at least in pretty good spirits throughout, despite fears for his health. But it does feel like a story that's being underreported, given how many interesting dimensions it has, including what it says about the Pope's determination to use his remaining years to reach out to other religions and his desire to connect to some of the world's more overlooked Catholic communities, and perhaps, I would say most intriguingly of all, what his stop in Singapore says, which has this very large ethnic Chinese population, and what that tells us about the Vatican's relationship not only with Chinese Catholics but also with China itself.
Well, what does it tell us, Harriet, about the Pope's relation with Chinese Catholics?
Yeah, so this is such an interesting one because it goes back centuries. I mean, it really goes back all the way to kind of, the early missionary work in the 16th century and all the tensions surrounding the Jesuits turning up in China and proselytizing. And, big tensions between traditional Chinese ancestor worship and what the Catholic Church might see as idolatry. So the Vatican actually banned Chinese Christians practicing the traditional rites back in the 18th century. And Catholicism sort of went underground. And then obviously after the Opium Wars and these, very unequal treaties with the West was really keen to push freedom of the Catholic Church in China. But it's mainly in this century, or last century, sorry, in the 20th century, that I think things got really dicey, because when China went communist and Mao took over, they severed ties with the Vatican in the 50s. So the Catholics in China kind of went underground. And that's where there's been this kind of division now in China between these underground Catholics that are loyal to the Vatican and what Beijing kind of allows as a sort of state-controlled Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association that kind of doesn't accept the Catholic superiority, and then the underground Catholics kind of don't accept the Communist Party's superiority. So it's basically this massive power struggle between, like, who's in charge of the Catholic Church and who appoints the bishops in China between communist loyalist and Vatican loyalist.
But it's not just about history, is it? And credit to you for including an answer there, Harriet, that included the sentence, obviously after the Opium Wars. But Irene, it's also about what's happened more recently, isn't it? And the controversy over the visit to East Timor as part of this itinerary.
Yeah, well, there has been quite a lot of controversy. You know, it's his 3-day visit to one of the world's poorest countries has ended up costing $12 million, and homes have been demolished, people have been evicted. I think I read that even $1 million has been spent on erecting a mass altar, which seems kind of crazy in a country where 42% of the population are living in poverty and struggling to put food on the table. And then you've also got the kind of sex abuse scandal, which hasn't really been acknowledged. You know, there were advocacy groups saying, look, we really need to talk about this. And although Pope Francis has kind of said, he sort of gave a vague, address saying, we need to do everything possible to prevent abuse. What people really wanted him to do was kind of tackle head on the case of when the Vatican actually admitted that it had secretly sanctioned a Timorese bishop following allegations that he sexually abused boys in the 1990s. So there's kind of been holes left where this could have been a good opportunity to kind of come down with more of a hardline stance on things like that, but he kind of failed to do that.
I suppose, though, Arion, just by the Pope turning up, Catholics in the country, and that's after all his main audience, will feel the balm of his arrival as a way of trying to heal over some of those scars, won't they? I mean, that's the point. He's very frail and old, as you were suggesting, and yet he's made the trip there despite that controversy.
I think so. And, the Pope specifically chose these 4 island nations in a bid to extend outreach to what he calls the peripheries, this term for overlooked, faraway places with small minority or persecuted Catholic communities. And I think you're right, just turning up is a kind of a gesture in its own right. But, this really was one of Francis's biggest engagements with Asia, which after all itself is a growing part of the world and has always been a bit of an ambition, a strategic objective of the Catholic Church to expand into. But I think that also the stop in Indonesia, where he started the tour, was quite interesting, because there it's kind of a reflection of Francis's interest in promoting dialogue between Muslims and Christians. And he was the first Pope, after all, to visit the Arabian Peninsula in 2019. And, when he was in Indonesia, he met with religious leaders in Jakarta's Istiqlal Mosque. And this was really what that leg of the trip was all about. The mosque is the largest in Southeast Asia, and it's connected to the capital's main Catholic cathedral via an underground tunnel of friendship, which was built in 2020 as a symbol of religious harmony between the two faiths. And, this is a big part of what Francis has been up to throughout the whole of his papacy. And I think that particular moment really highlights the way that he has tried throughout the time that he's been in charge of the Catholic Church to try and reach out with these sort of idea of shared values across religions and ethnicities and beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very delicate tightrope, isn't it, Harriet, that the Pope has to walk in this sense when he's talking to kind of interfaith groups. I mean, he makes a big show of kissing imams' hands and all the rest of it. But I mean, the bottom line is, yes, he can underline the similarities between the Abrahamic faiths, but ideally he'd rather like it if everyone converted to Catholicism.
Yeah, see, this is where it gets really tricky with some of the Asian countries, and particularly China, is about that suspicion, that kind of seeing these kinds of religious outreach as a sort of another form of colonialism or proselytizing, dangerous evangelism. That I think that's a real root of a lot of the suspicion, particularly in China. But I think the Indonesia one is really interesting because although, yes, Catholics are a minority in Indonesia. It's like a 90% Muslim majority country. I think it's still like 8 million Catholics. I mean, Indonesia's the fourth most populous country in the world. I don't know if we can call it a periphery either, when it's technically the third biggest democracy in the world, and it's really becoming important on the world stage. But yeah, absolutely, it's a very delicate line to tread, and it's also a very delicate line in terms of the history of missionary work and the history of Catholicism and its proselytizing around the world. I do think, though, that the decision to kiss the hand of the Grand Imam it's an image that I think will have very powerful repercussions around Southeast Asia and around the world, kind of on the whole.
Irenie.
Yeah, and I think overall, though, we've got to remember that really it is kind of just a big PR campaign, and that, you know, he's there for one reason, to get as many people as possible to, you know, to extend his reach. So, you know, however many photo ops and all of these things that there are, it doesn't take away from the reason that he's actually there. But
there are criticisms, aren't there, even within the Catholic Church, that he's going there at all because of his age, because of his frailty.
Well, yeah, and he's had to take a lot of time off from, you know, he's had bouts of influenza, you know, he's increasingly being wheeled around in a wheelchair. And, you know, it's obviously not the same with the Pope, but when you look at how much stick all of the politicians get for being kind of unfit for purpose and can they do their job, it's fair to say that he's had a few people asking and questioning whether he should resign. He actually kind of came out with this new memoir earlier this year saying that he's got absolutely no plans to resign at all and will kind of stay on till the bitter end unless, you know, something happens where he's actually kind of incapacitated. So it doesn't sound like he has any plans to go anywhere.
It's mad, isn't it, Arion, that open talk about resignation of a pope is a thing again? I mean, it's really just because of his predecessor.
Yeah, exactly. And there was that brief overlap between the time that Benedict stepped down and Francis became the new pope. And there was this sort of pope and anti-pope idea, particularly amongst the sort of conservative wing of Catholicism that didn't like the idea of Francis and everything that he represented and wanted to regard him as a sort of outlier that would soon be replaced by an incoming, more direct successor to JP2 and Benedict. So the idea that you might want to get that sort of complexity by having another pope step down and getting another one in the mix, I think wouldn't be something that's terribly tempting to the Catholic Church as it is today. But I mean, you know, I think the Pope is showing that he's well enough to be doing this tour. He's recently sometimes foregone his wheelchair and walked around the place, despite the fact that he's had some pretty serious health concerns, including a hernia operation and colon surgery, and he's been hospitalized with respiratory infections and so on. He is also being accompanied by his medical team, including 2 nurses and a doctor, so there are people to look after him if anything goes wrong. But I think that people are feeling as though, even in spite of, or maybe even because of the fact that he's feeling his advancing years, that's part of the thing that's motivating him. His supporters say that it's his passion that drives him, and although he's being careful to avoid the idea that he's being too directly evangelizing in that historical sense of what mission was about, with all of the connotations of colonialism that carried, I think that he still does want to do what Pope Francis has always been about, which is sort of trying to reach out with good listening and doing good things and sometimes challenging ideas, but in a gentle way that he hopes will be reflective of stuff that, yes, probably in his heart of hearts might bring people over to the Catholic Church. But I think that really is what is driving him on this whole big 12-day tour that must be really quite taxing for a man of his age.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial point about the Indonesia trip in particular, because he's been such a passionate advocate of environmentalism and green policies, and he's really very much kind of seen as the environmental pope, the political environmental pope. And, you know, Indonesia, Jakarta in particular, it's a huge polluter. I mean, I think to characterize this tour as a sort of either a PR opportunity stunt, let's say, or as part of a wider drive to kind of convert more Catholics, is to miss how much of an impact it could potentially have, particularly in countries where Catholics, although, for example, in East Timor, they are, you know, Catholics are the majority, it's, you know, nearly 98%. There are still a persecuted minority in some areas of Asia. And I think also in terms of the political aspect, you know, the trip to Singapore has been categorized as a way to reach out to China, you know, with 3/4 of the population being ethnically Chinese, and it's somewhere that Beijing watches very closely. But the Vatican also has ties with Taiwan, which is very, very, very problematic for China, obviously. But this year, it also announced that it was planning to build a permanent base in China, which is a massive step forward in relations between China and the Holy See. and also because he's the first Latin American pope, and Latin America is a massive area of interest for China at the moment. I think that this trip is far more than just a PR opportunity or a way to convert more people. It's a really big opportunity for massive advancement in a lot of diplomatic ways.
Okay, Arion, I suppose just finally on this, if you're listening to this and you're not Catholic and or Chinese, then why does this matter?
Yeah, I think that Pope Francis has obviously represented a slight change of gear for the Catholic Church, and he has been as vocal as someone in his position can be about trying to change the church's attitude on really big questions like marriage and gender and sexuality, and he's been very clear in his desire to return to the church as much as possible to an interest in poor people, as well as all of the vestiges of gold this and drapery that. I think that he really has tried to represent something that is other to that. And I think that as he is approaching the later stage of his career, he's got one eye on all of that. And this outreach program, as Harriet says, it's certainly not just a PR exercise, but I think it is partially connected to who and what he has represented throughout his entire life, which is this big connection with other faiths and also an interest in kind of visiting the poorer parts of the world. East Timor is one of the poorest countries in the region, and he stopped off there, and it delighted half the country's population. So I think that it's a really good microscopic view of the macro of his papacy, and it's just it's a really good summary and a way that this probably won't be his last trip, but if it were, it would be a pretty good summation of everything he's represented throughout his life.
Okay. Next up, Harriet's scoring us some ketamine. That's after this. Okay, Harriet, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we all in a K-hole?
I literally just lay there. I can wiggle my toes. I can wiggle my fingers. I'm still here. But for whatever reason, my eyes and my brain start seeing a cinematic piece of art.
Podcaster Marky speaking on a recent episode of her show Happy Everly After. And what was she discussing, Harriet?
Well, she was talking about something that links surgical patients, the club dance scene, horse tranquilizers, war veterans, Hollywood celebrities, Elon Musk, Donald Trump's niece, those Thai boys that were trapped in a cave that time, and me.
We didn't start the fire.
Yeah, that is not a lovely song by Billy Joel. That is the drug ketamine. So it does seem like ketamine's been making headlines, every week for years now, particularly for its potential in treating psychiatric disorders. But what's going under the radar, I think, is the growing number of people addicted to ketamine. So the Times published a report this week suggesting that in the UK, ketamine addiction has more than quadrupled since 2016. Obviously, we can't get exact figures on usage, but estimates suggest that ketamine usage has more than doubled since 2016. But what's really eye-catching here, I think, about this story is that estimated usage among young people, so people under 25, has more than tripled since 2016, and it hit a record last year with approximately 1 in 20 young people saying that they've tried it.
Wow. I mean, Irene, is it something that you've noticed be a bigger thing amongst Gen Z, ketamine addiction?
Not necessarily among, people that I know. But I do remember a time when I was at kind of university around then, there was a lot of it about. So, yeah. But
in what form? How were people taking it?
They were kind of like putting it on their gums and all sorts, really. So I'm not sure how it's changed now, but if that's what it was like when I was at uni, which is kind of coming up to 10 years ago, then it sounds like it's got even more prevalent since then.
And why do you think that might be? Because, I mean, the Times article that Harriet was referring to there was speculating that it's about price, really, and they were saying that you could basically score some ketamine for a tenner, and actually that's, that's 1.5 pints in a pub these days.
I guess it's partly about price, but I was thinking maybe it could also be due to kind of changing perceptions, because there's so much media coverage at the moment that, it's being like medically treating depression and anxiety and PTSD and all these things. There's obviously a mental health crisis in young people, and they're thinking, oh, well, I could use that, and then things get out of hand.
Yeah, it's not just been destigmatised, has it? It's kind of got a halo around it in certain quarters. We'll
Exactly.
return to that in a minute, the mental health aspect. I mean, firstly, Arion, on the physical health, though, let's just outline what the dangers are of becoming dependent on ketamine.
Yeah, the most prominent physical side effect of ketamine is its effects on the bladder. And basically, ongoing use of ketamine can thicken the bladder wall and shrink it, which can cause users to become incontinent. And what really sucks about ketamine is that its effects on the bladder can be so severe and painful that only really, really strong painkillers can help, like, say, ketamine. So it has this sort of cyclical effect. And, the impact of more people taking more ketamine has meant that there's sort of increasing numbers of young men and women who are reporting to hospitals with bladder issues, and some of them are ending up being advised that their only course of action is to take their bladder out, often leaving them with a stoma to catch their urine that they have to carry with them. And what's worse, it can lead to complications. There was a quote in this BBC article about what's going on from Dr. Carolina Ochoa, who's a consultant urologist. And she said, if we're offering major surgery to a person who's 21, then the likelihood of having any sort of complications after that surgery in the rest of their lives, it's enormous, she said. So I think that there's this feeling that not only is it having an impact in the immediate term, but it's going to potentially have long-term effects as well. There is a good news story about it, which is that early intervention and specifically stopping using ketamine and in some cases going on prescribed medications can help people get their use of their bladder back to normal. But once it's gone past a certain point, then the damage is done, and doctors say that from that point it's pretty irreversible and lifelong.
And Harriet, you've actually been given ketamine as a medical treatment.
Yeah, I mean, it's been used as an anaesthetic in the UK since the 1960s, and I had a minor surgery on my leg a couple of years ago, and the anaesthetic was ketamine, and that was never explained at the forefront. But what happened for me is that when I woke up, I first experienced what is a very typical side effect of taking ketamine, which is this pain-free, mildly hallucinogenic, dissociative state of kind of calm, happy, semi-catatonia, which is very attractive, and it's also one of the reasons why it's been shown to be incredibly effective as a treatment for drug-resistant depression, PTSD, postpartum depression in particular. It's kind of emerged as like one of the biggest advancements in psychiatric treatment in the last few decades. It's incredible, but the come down I experienced, which I'm not sure is typical, but it wasn't pretty memorable. It was a real big crash, for a few days. And because it works, because it's so effective, because it makes people feel better and takes away pain, misery, anxiety, suffering, that in itself is very addictive. So it's a sort of catch-22 situation, and that the perception of the drug had changed. So, it's a huge staple of the rave scene in the 90s, a big dance culture drug. And then it's kind of emerged now as this, like, Elon Musk massively endorsed it earlier this year, saying that he took it regularly and would advise other business leaders to do that, and kind of exploded on public consciousness last year when it was implicated in the death of Matthew Perry, who played Chandler Bing on Friends. But I think that the big reason, apart from what you mentioned about the price point, it being so much cheaper for young people than MDMA, cocaine, alcohol, smoking, going out to eat, whatever, it had a huge moment during the pandemic. All drugs trends are cyclical and they all come back around. But during the pandemic, when sales of cocaine and ecstasy massively tanked because people weren't going out and partying, like MDMA sales too, that's when ketamine, they saw a massive uptick. And particularly because people could order it on social media. You can order it on Snapchat, SoundCloud, even Instagram,
SoundCloud? What? Isn't that just an app where people sell their dodgy mixtapes? I mean, it's not like, how did that become a drug trading app? When did that happen?
I would assume that there's particular genres of music which people, if they're sharing and communicating about, then that might be where those conversations would at least begin.
Yeah.
And then maybe swap details of Telegram or Signal or something more encrypted.
Yes. There's also, Arion, beyond social media, the trend of ketamine becoming a fashion. I've seen the term ketamine chic being bandied around.
Yeah, I had to go and consult Dazed to update me on what ketamine chic was exactly, but Dazed described it as a mashup culture where the aesthetics of disparate eras and social tribes are mega-mixed almost endlessly. So we have the 2010s redux of 90s tattoos, chokers, alongside noughties, mini bags, etnies, sneakers, and Snapchat's dog filter. The overall impact is less retina burning and more brain melting. But it says that there's a sort of a kind of nihilism to it. It's a kind of no rules, everything at once, anything goes, you know, as they say, chuck it on the bonfire and watch it glisten.
No idea what you're talking about. And this is why I don't read.
Well, actually, and then they had lots of pictures to go with it, and it really is just kind of a mashup look combined with then this really sort of lo-fi sound that I have actually, as you asked Harriet about how you get ketamine on SoundCloud, and there are lots of mixes, SoundCloud mixes of ketamine music. I don't know if that directly leads you to the drug's door, but certainly there's a genre that you can listen to while you're attempting it.
But that does suggest, doesn't it, Irene, because that's all happening on the open web, right? That does suggest that maybe the police aren't investigating this as seriously as other drugs, maybe because it is prescribed in medical settings, but maybe that's part of the reason that it's caught on. People don't think it's a particularly serious crime to have it.
Yeah, and I think one of the most disturbing things that's kind of come out recently is these kind of cases of ketamine injections being used as a law enforcement tool in the US. So earlier this year, a report by the Associated Press found this practice of police working with paramedics, and if they come across someone who hasn't necessarily committed a crime but is in a state of what they call excited delirium and seems agitated, then they'll give them a dose of ketamine. They'll inject them with ketamine, and there's been kind of some quite shocking figures that between 2012 and 2021 at least 94 people have died after they were restrained by police and given those sedatives by the paramedics. And one of the kind of most harrowing cases is that of Olly Mann, who was a massage therapist walking home in Denver. He was stopped by police purely because they were looking for someone who looked sketchy and dodgy in the area. And following a sort of confrontation, paramedics injected him with a maximum dose of ketamine, and he died in hospital 3 days later. And there was a huge kind of uproar about this, and the paramedic ended up being jailed for 5 years. But, you know, that's one of the cases that has actually hit the press. But it's probably the actual figures are a lot higher when this is just used to kind of control people, you know, a bit like how tasering is.
Wow, that's fascinating. And when it comes to the recreational use of the drug, Harriet, is there an argument, as we were discussing with cannabis a few weeks ago, for decriminalisation, for actually, you know, not because you can prescribe it, can't you? Like you said, you administer it as an anaesthetic anyway.
You can. Although I think it's worth saying that it's a Class B drug. It was made a legal Class B drug in the UK.
But the mental health treatment is about microdosing, isn't it? So it's about small amounts. If it was much clearer how to take it, it would be safer. It's
a very specific way that you are allowed to be prescribed it in the EU and the UK. So this was approved in 2019. It's the drug esketamine, which ketamine is sort of the parent compound. It's like a form of ketamine, and that is allowed to be prescribed as a treatment in the UK and the EU for drug-resistant depression. And there's also a lot of studies going on at the moment to show how it can be used to break alcohol addiction. It's a big study that was launched in August. Injections shown to reduce postpartum depression in new mothers by 75%. So there is all that ongoing. But I think in terms of the blurring of the lines between legal and illegal, I think that's where the Matthew Perry and the celebrity angle in Hollywood was really interesting. All these pieces came out about the epidemic of ketamine use in Hollywood. And it's worth noting, I think, still that the usage and the addiction numbers of ketamine, although are small, in some places like Hollywood and in Silicon Valley, where Elon Musk being a typical example of this, it's absolutely ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And there are, you know, Matthew Perry was first legally prescribed ketamine and then moved on to illegal prescriptions from shady doctors. And that's happening absolutely everywhere. So it's a really blurry line. And, when we're talking about the ketamine chic and the aesthetic, a lot of DJs now want ketamine banned on the dance floor. It was a staple of 90s rave culture because they say it's turning people into zombies. They're not dancing, they're not interacting with people. So I think that's really why I chose this as my story of the week, because although the numbers are small, they're skyrocketing. It's on so many different stratas of society and various different forms and ways. The UK ketamine market is absolutely booming. There's a really high purity, and it still costs the same as it did 20 years ago. It seems to be kind of an inflation-proof product, and the wholesale price is dropping. So in terms of where this could go and why it's been so popular since the pandemic, that people are choosing a drug that makes them feel better. I mean, Cosmo did a really brilliant piece on this about why young people in particular are choosing it. It makes people feel like they're out of their own body, out of their minds, that may or may not be suffering with anxiety, depression, the post-pandemic massive mental health crisis. What I think, although we should be careful of kind of extrapolating any motives behind drug taking, because every drug has its trend cycle, but I do think it's interesting that this anesthetic, this kind of antidepressant, mildly hallucinogenic form of escape seems to be the real drug of choice among young people in the UK. And what does that say about what they're going through?
Well, you mentioned Elon Musk. There's more of that after this. Irenie, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The real cost of $1 trillion.
How are the freedom of speech wars going? This is you've been at war for 2 years now.
Yes.
The price of freedom of speech is not cheap, is it?
I think it's like 44 billion, something like that.
Just
round numbers.
give or take $1 billion.
Yeah, round numbers. Yeah.
Elon Musk on stage at the All In Summit on Tuesday, in the kind of context he'd like to be seen, Irenie, as a free speech warrior. But it's his bank balance you're interested in.
Yeah, so I was quite interested to see that this week a new report has come out showing that if he continues as he is, Elon Musk is on track to become the world's first trillionaire by 2027. He's already the richest person in the world with a net worth of around $250 billion. And his wealth is growing at an average rate of about 110%. But it's a question that has kind of fascinated people for a long time. And it's over the years, it keeps changing who's going to be the first trillionaire. And it's something that really kind of splits people's opinions.
Okay. And is there any other competition, by the way? I mean, is there any chance it won't be Elon Musk who's the first trillionaire, or is that question now resolved? It's going to be him?
I mean, it looks like it could well be him, but, wealth can fluctuate massively. Like, obviously, he's...
Particularly when you invest in space rockets and social media, I imagine.
Well, exactly. And, we've got to remember he was also the first person to ever lose $200 billion. Yeah. So, and he's seen the value of X plummet ever since he's taken over. So it's definitely not a sure thing. And there's other people kind of in the running. Before the pandemic, it was Jeff Bezos, obviously, who was on track to kind of take the title. And now he's been pushed back to 2030. And there's Gautam Adani, the Indian businessman, who's the founder and chairman of Adani Group. So he's currently on track to become the second trillionaire. He's currently kind of got a net worth of 80 billion. And then kind of other people in the top handful, we've got Bernard Arnault.
He's the LVMH guy, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. And then Mark Zuckerberg is still, set to become a trillionaire. He's still up there, but not until 2030, apparently.
Okay, I mean, it's a huge amount of money, but it's very hard for me to get my head around. So what's a billionaire is 100 million, isn't it? Or then in US dollars, it's 1,000 million? What's a trillion?
So a trillion is actually 1,000 billion, which is such a it's such a difficult figure to get your head around. To put that in perspective, if you imagine a stack of $1,000 bills 4 inches high, that's $1 million. But if you had a stack of $1,000 bills 67 miles high, that would make you a trillionaire.
Wow.
Arion, take us back. Who was the first millionaire and then billionaire?
Okay, so look, deep in history, you get very wealthy figures based on how much of the world they conquered, like Augustus Caesar or Genghis Khan or Egypt's Ramses II. Then you get kind of figures who were wealthy because of the money they spent. If you think of King Louis XIV of France, who spent the equivalent of, it's now estimated, 200 to 300 billion building Versailles, and that wasn't his only palace, by the way. Similarly, the pyramids and the sphinxes were very costly, but, you know, they were sort of written off as being justified because the rulers in question were believed to have been chosen by gods. I suppose Elon Musk might put himself in that category potentially. But then the first recognized dollar millionaire was John Jacob Astor, who was a German-American businessman. He made his fortune in the 18th and 19th centuries, basically by buying and selling stuff, specifically fur and New York real estate and opium that had been smuggled into China. Astor was also very good at spotting trends, so he was one of those people whose wealth was generating more wealth, which I think, again, is a quality of the best billionaires today. And the first billionaire was John D. Rockefeller, and he built and invested in oil refineries just as the world was getting itself hooked on kerosene and gasoline. He came to preside over a vast monopoly that strangled out the other competition, which made him and his firm, which was called Standard Oil, even richer. And I think that's another earmark of contemporary billionaires, which is that they don't necessarily take to competition terribly well, and states haven't been all that good at regulating them. Today, there are said to be 2,640 billionaires in the world, according to Forbes. And it's interesting to see how the way that they make their money has shifted from specifically owning land or physical things to, you know, inheriting assets. That's a big one. But then trading in ideas, specifically finance and tech ideas, and profiting more or less from knowledge and ideas and taking punts on things than the material world. So there's been a big shift in how people are making money.
Yeah, and Harriet, the way that Elon Musk makes money is through SpaceX and through Tesla, right? I mean, we can all get a bit distracted by X because that's his pronouncement platform, but he's not making money through those things. Will he reach $1 trillion, do you think, from the things that he is doing that are successful and profitable?
Well, this is what I think is really interesting about this story, because it's actually very difficult to get an exact figure on what Musk is worth, but also what he has. As you said, he's the CEO of Tesla, and he owns the private rocket company SpaceX, and really crucially the subsidiary of SpaceX, Starlink, the satellite internet service, which we've spoken about on the podcast before, and I think we might come back to.
One to watch.
But in terms of Twitter, what we do know is that he only used some of his cash for that 44 billion. Most of it was borrowed in a kind of a leveraged buyout. It's the Twitter takeover is now known to be the worst buyout for banks since the financial crisis, because investors, it looks like they've lost like 24 billion on this purchase of Twitter, because the value of what is now known as X has just plummeted since Elon Musk bought it.
But that's because he came in and made it worse. I mean, it really is as simple as that.
He did. I mean, it's almost exclusively down to what he himself has said and done with the platform. But in terms of the money, I'm just going to turn to a new excerpt from this new book that's coming out about the Twitter takeover, which I think says a lot about Elon Musk's finances. This is the excerpt from these two New York Times reporters. The Twitter's finance teams were trying to figure out where the money was coming from, and they couldn't, because they were kind of trying to debate whether he had this secret stash of cryptocurrency or he used his SpaceX as like collateral. He did actually borrow $1 billion from SpaceX and then kind of paid it back with interest the next month, but it wasn't transparent with Twitter where the money was coming from, because normally you would have it kind of traced, all the origins of all the places' money. But what Musk did was dump all of the funds into one account, so you couldn't trace where they were from. So I think we can not necessarily have to go into too much detail about that, but the one thing to take away here is right at that crunch point of purchase, they came back to Twitter and said, we don't have enough money. We're going to have to take, I think it was 2.5 billion from Twitter's own money to help buy Twitter, which obviously is completely unethical, possibly illegal and fraudulent. But it does, I think, it really paints a picture of a very murky very murky sources of wealth. We're not really 100% sure, and therefore I think that we have to approach the story with a kind of a healthy degree of skepticism.
Yeah, well, with that in mind, Irene, do you think this is good publicity or bad publicity if Elon Musk becomes the first trillionaire? You know, I mean, on the one hand, it sort of helps his image amongst people who think of him as a great entrepreneur, you know, puts his fingers on anything, he turns to gold. But then for everyone else who despises what he's done to social media, but also worries about the influence that he has on the world, and he's going to be controlling the internet for a lot of people, as well as our future in space, they might just say this is too much power in one person's hands. It's going to feed into that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's going to absolutely love it if he manages it. But I mean, we've got to look at the kind of pretty terrible things that he's been saying online. And it's like, do we want somebody with those kind of opinions to get to such a powerful position? You know, we know that when people get to these sort of fabulous levels of wealth, that they start to kind of, you know, be able to have sway over politics, over the media, over kind of, you know, he's got this huge government contract with SpaceX. So it starts to kind of get more and more unfair, and it makes people more and more polarized.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, that, you know, too much attention on what he's up to and the potential for any one of those men that Irene mentioned becoming the first trillionaire in the world. I think it does focus the mind on the idea that maybe something needs to be done about this focusing of wealth towards just a few people. And the thing is, we do actually know how to do it. You know, things like raising taxes and bolstering democratic institutions and using state power to try to redistribute resources away from those who have a lot already to those who need a little bit more. But I think the thing is that those initiatives can only happen with enough public support. And I think many people argue that if you institute those measures, then you are somehow damaging the capitalist project in some way, because people, even if they're at a comparatively low level of wealth, want for the idea that they can pursue unfettered riches throughout the rest of their life.
Surely that's a line in the sand on that argument, Harriet. I understand, you know, people aspire to send their children to private school. People aspire to have a second property. But you do not need $1 trillion.
Yeah, I think there's a really big difference between like the capitalist search for wealth and what people like Elon Musk and these other nearly trillionaires are doing. But just as we're talking about Elon Musk, let's focus on what he's bought with all this money, because I think the really important thing here is that this kind of wealth, it buys you so much power. You know, what Elon Musk did with Twitter, I think, takes most attention. He basically bought the world's biggest megaphone, amplifying his own Nazi apologism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, racism.
And if Trump wins the presidential election, he's bought himself a seat in American government.
I mean, with X as well, he was able to interview Donald Trump as if that would ever have happened before. He has this massive amount of reach, and has cooked the algorithm and fired all the security people. So these right-wing, very dangerous views are fermenting further online. He played a huge part in the UK riots as well recently. But I think to focus too much on Twitter is to lose sight of where the real power is in terms of all this money, which, as we mentioned, is SpaceX. This is rocket company, this massive government contracts, and also the satellite internet service that he owns, where, as we've spoken about before, he was able to kind of pick and choose. He granted Ukraine internet access when Russia tried to shut it off to keep them in the war. He then said he would do the same for Gaza, and then quickly roll back on that when Netanyahu intervened. He has an extraordinary amount of power in giving and taking away access to the internet all over the world. He's in a big fight with Brazil at the moment over the Supreme Court ban on X. But with SpaceX, with these government contracts and these rockets that he's building, I mean, he is the ultimate unelected leader. He may not be world leader as we understand it, but this money has made him a leader in the online space and possibly a leader in a future world in space as well. That's what money buys. That's not a capitalist project. That is anti-democratic at its most big and loud and really quite terrifying.
Arion, what would be the first thing you'd buy if you had $1 trillion?
Well, the funny thing is, when people have asked the question, what would you do if you won the lottery, I've always said that I'd like to have a party on the moon. But actually, I don't think any lottery win would get me to that objective of having a big party on the moon that I've long said I wanted to do. I sort of see eye to eye with Elon Musk on this one. And so maybe I would actually need to go in pursuit of trillions to execute something like that.
Okay, so I think your answer to that is you'd try and start a civil civil war in democracies. Irene, what would you do with $1 trillion?
I think the first thing I would do is maybe buy a whole house in Crouch End. And I wouldn't have to live in this flat anymore.
Have a little bit of change, even in Crouch End. Harriet?
I was going to say, the way things are going in London, that'll probably be the price of a travel card for the year. That's what I would do with it.
I'd buy the Muppets IP, but I don't know what I'd do with the rest of it.
Oh, that's a good one.
Good.
That's a really good
then
one.
I can have all the spin-offs I want.
An Olly Muppet.
My thanks to Harriet, Irene and Arion. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. It's free. You don't need to be a trillionaire. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.